There was only one truly great poetic genius in his time, Christopher Marlowe, born in the same year than Shakespeare, only 2 months apart in 1564, who in his 30th year in May 1593 was threatened by execution, following slanderous accusations against him by the English Crown and Church. A feigned death, staged in Deptford, with the help of Marlowe's employer, the senior advisor of Queen Elizabeth, William Cecil, Lord Burghley, saw him banished for his own safety, but at the price of a permanent loss of identity and name. William Cecil allowed Marlowe to escape into internal banishment and exile, writing henceforth behind a curtain of multiple pen names and pseudonyms. Prior to his feigned death, Marlowe was by far the most famous poet and dramatist and superstar of the London theatre. He wrote by no means only under the name of Shakespeare, but under many other pseudonyms as well, which he changed throughout his life, not the least for safety reasons. His multiple pseudonymities explain most of the paradoxes of the many Shakespeare authorship candidates, most of them with virtually no reliable life data. Others were simply inventions of names, or borrowed names of living or deceased persons like Shakespeare from Stratford. Marlowe was living, incognito after his alleged murder under changing pen names such as Ledoux, Toby Matthew, Thomas Shelton. And he was writing under an unimaginable number of changing pseudonyms such as Wither, Peacham, Davenant, May, Chapman, Sylvester, Sands, Drayton, Beaumont, Fletcher, Hayward, Shakespeare, Massinger and others. As absurd, ridiculous or unthinkable it may sound, equivalent to Shakespeare. The number of literary inconsistencies and historical contradictions in Michael Drayton's work is so powerful, that one has to postulate, he hasn't been a genuine, independent poet, but another pseudonym or alias, of the concealed, true Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe. How to explain that the literary output of Michael Drayton, born 1563 even prior to Marlowe and Shakespeare, basically begins after Marlowe's death in 1593. This cannot be theoretically plausibly substantiated. Who wants us make to believe that Drayton, the most congenial contemporary poet next to Shakespeare, Marlowe, started his literary career, analogous to Shakespeare, only after Marlowe's alleged death, in his 4th decade of life. And, how to explain, that the same question has scarcely ever been posed to other close literary contemporaries of Marlowe and Shakespeare such as George Chapman, Thomas Heywood, Gervase Markham, Richard Barnfield, or the strange and bizarre double of Sir John Davies and John Davies of Hereford. That is why all those outstanding poets began their literary career only after Marlowe's death and didn't overlap in time for decades. Early on, Drayton has been considered a pioneer of the sonneteering obsession in Elizabethan England, with significant influences on Shakespeare's sonnets. Conspicuously, Drayton started his poetical career as late as in his fourth decade of life, and only after Marlowe's death in 1593, with the sonnet sequence idea, The Shepherd's Garland. A strikingly close and similar situation, compared to Shakespeare's Opus 1, Venus and Adonis, also in 1593. Idea The Shepherd's Garland had a subtitle. Roland's Sacrifice to the Nine Muses, that is to the inspirational goddesses of his literature, poetry, and art. What may have been the meaning of the author's sacrifice to his muses, and the overall message of this evocative subtitle? The most logical and plausible interpretation of the poet's sacrifice. In order to stay alive, the deadly threatened poet, alias Roland, within weeks after Marlowe's death in 1593, obeyed the crown by sacrificing his identity, his name and fame, to his goddesses of literature, poetry and art. This hidden message is supported by an additional Latin title phrase from Ovid's Elegy, reminiscent to the Latin title phrase of Shakespeare's Opus 1, Venus and Adonis, of the same year. soon after Drayton's idea The Shepherd's Garland, in 1593. A second series of poems by Drayton was printed, dealing again with idea, entitled Idea's Mirror, with 51 superior sonnets. The sonnet cycle is inspired by the author's inner inspiration, his female counterpart, he labels Idea. Be aware that these sonnets, amours, are by no means amatory sonnets, as proposed to be directed at Anne Rainsford, Nagudia. The sonnets portray and mirror, authentically, the author's fate and, autobiographically, the deep inner conflicts of the author's actual life situation in 1593 to 1594. These insights must remain completely incomprehensible, as long as the Marlowe, Shakespeare thesis is denied. Reflect exemplarily some short sections of 3 sonnets. In 1594, a yet unknown author, Michael Drayton, composed a high-profile historical poem on Piers Gaveston, 290, 6-line verses, describing on a surface level the life and fate of Gaveston, as the first Earl of Cornwall. Consider that in Marlowe's play, Edward II, in the evocative figure of Gaveston, the author introduced himself intensively, without any doubt. The play was entered into the Stationers' Register 5 weeks after Marlowe's official death, and published in 1594, the same years as Drayton's poem Piers Gaveston was printed. You may ask yourself, why in 1594 a previously unknown poet, Michael Drayton, in his first English poem, already at the highest stage of poetical perfection, portrayed the fatal destiny of Marlowe's self-identification, Gaveston, from his play Edward II, of the same year. The only logic, or most plausible answer is, that concealed Christopher Marlowe, under the pseudonym of a yet unknown poet, Michael Drayton, intended to disclose his fatal personal life situation to his friends, and to the world, in a roundabout way. Who wants us make to believe that it's coincidental that within the months of Marlowe's final disappearance an unknown poet Michael Drayton writes Piers Gaveston, in 1593, disclosing us Marlowe's fate. He just had masked in the figure Gaveston of his own play Edward II in the same year.
Foul sleep god Morpheus, curtains up the light, and shuts my fame in everlasting night. My name and fame, they seek to scandalize, and root the same from all posterities. Thus, do I change my habit and my name. From place to place I pass unknown of any. But swift report so far had spread my fame. I hear my life and youth, controlled of many. The boozing Flemings in their boisterous tongue, still talking on me, as I pass along. Accursed to die, forbidden to be slain. A vagabond, and wandering still abroad. In Flanders thus, I travel all alone. Still seeking rest, yet ever finding none. I now embark me in a Flemish hoy, disguised in the habit of muff, attended thus, with neither man nor boy, but on my back a little bag of stuff, like to a soldier, that in camp of late had been employed in service, with the state.
Drayton in 1595, used the ancient mythological tale, Endymion and Phoebe, as a metaphor of his own life, as an allegorical parable on his actual fate as a poet. The myth of a poetical genius with an enforced, everlasting sleep symbolizes the author's permanent disappearance and his loss of identity. The female equivalent to Apollo, Phoebe, or Selene, the moon goddess, was allowed by Zeus to bring his mortal son Endymion, she loved, into a perpetual sleep. The metaphor of a perpetual sleep is reminiscent to the prologue of two closely related plays. 1. The anonymous taming of a shrew, in 1594. Guess by whom? The other, the strongly modified Shakespeare play, The Taming of their Shrew, printed 30 years later, in 1623 in the first folio, and also in 1631. Both isolated prologue plays unmistakably deal with an allegorical story of an endless sleeper, Christopher Sly, who wakened up after 30 years, turned from a beggar into a lord. Yet never could this paradise word light, illuminated still with Phoebe's glorious sight. She laid Endymion on a grassy bed, with summer's arras richly overspread, where from her sacred mansion next above, she might descend and sport her with her love, which 30 years the shepherd safely kept, who in her bosom soft and soundly slept. Yet as a dream, he thought the time not long, remaining ever beautiful and young. And what in vision there to him befell, my weary muse, some other time shall tell. And you, the heirs of ever-living fame, the worthy title of a poet's name, abundant textual observations on Michael Drayton ever have been plausibly explained. For example, it has been worked out that there is a clear influence of Shakespeare's first tetralogy, Henry VI, 1, 2 and 3, and Richard III, on Drayton's historical poetry. Lines from Drayton's England's Heroical Epistles, in 1597, appear in the folio texts, Henry VI, 2 and 3, but not in the early quarto and octavo texts of these plays. And so on. The Diary of the Reverend John Ward, Vicar of Stratford, extending from 1648 to 1679, contains the only known account of Shakespeare's demise. Listen carefully and think twice. On March 6, 1662 he noted in his diary,
Shakespeare, Drayton and Ben Jonson had a merry meeting, and it seems drank too hard, for Shakespeare died of a fever. They're contracted.
What on earth, in 1616, was the actual reason that William Shakespeare, long since retired, as experts emphasize, met with the London poets, Drayton and Jonson, in the provincial town of Stratford, weeks prior to his death? One can assume with some plausibility that Ward's diary informations corresponded to the state of the general knowledge or of rumors about the deceased businessman Shakespeare within the provincial town of Stratford. During the early decades of the 17th century, which led to the erection of his monument in the Trinity Church of Stratford, prior to 1624. 1 month prior to Shakespeare's death in Stratford, he signed the second draft of his will, see Arrow, which was written by an unknown writer or scribe. A Shakespeare scholar and professional paleographer, Charles Hamilton, elaborated that the handwriting of Shakespeare's will is identical to the hand D of the play Sir Thomas More, 1593, which by most Stratfordian scholars today is attributed to William Shakespeare from Stratford. How did Charles Hamilton come to his conclusion? Charles Hamilton fashioned the composite by alternating handwritten lines from hand D of the play Sir Thomas More, M, with lines from Shakespeare's will, W. Hamilton concluded that the hand that wrote as hand D is the same hand that wrote the 3 pages of Shakespeare's will. It is difficult to imagine a more convincing proof that the 2 documents were written by the same hand. Please perceive the enormity of this evidence. The evidence is pretty apparent. The slopes of the writing, the shapes of the characters, the spacing of the words, and numerous other idiosyncrasies, allow but one conclusion. The hand that wrote as hand D of the play Sir Thomas More in 1593, is the same hand that wrote the 3 pages of Shakespeare's will. That is, the scribe of the lines of Shakespeare's will, was the true, concealed poet Marlowe, who was hiding in 1616 behind one of his pen names, Michael Drayton. This best explains the rather obscure meeting of Drayton and Johnson in Stratford at the time of Shakespeare's death, in early 1616. Dr. John Hall, Shakespeare's son-in-law, was married with his daughter Susanna in 1607. He was a prominent physician in Stratford, who kept notes in a casebook in abbreviated Latin, on those he treated. 9 years after Dr. Hall's death, in 1644, a physician James Cook visited Dr. John Hall's widow Susanna, Shakespeare's daughter, to see the books he had left. She sold him 2 manuscript notebooks written in Latin script. He eventually translated one of the notebooks and published it in 1657, left side. From Dr. Cook's report of the meeting, we learn that neither Shakespeare's daughter Susanna, nor her husband himself, was aware of any literary activity by William Shakespeare, who had lived in the very house they were standing in. Among the documented patients Hall treated was the poet Michael Drayton. Parliamentire, in 1595, is a literary allegoric essay of an author W.C., not securely identifiable. He conveys his fall to an educated class, by incorporating it into a philosophical historical essay. He criticizes the circumstances, which brought him down. It is a clear indictment against persons and authorities, which caused his fall and can at the same time be recognized as a plea against its treatment as a poet. If you take into account the overwhelming number of clues, there can be no doubt that behind the initials W.C. can only hide Marlowe, alias Shakespeare. In the pretext of the first folio, that is the first complete volume of Shakespeare's plays, printed in 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare's death, there is a conspicuous contextual clue, indicating that its author, William Shakespeare, seemingly came from a place near the River Avon, for example Stratford. Ben Jonson tells us allegorically, that Shakespeare's mind, in each line, shines through, and that it seems, he shakes a spear, brandishing the sweet swan of Avon at our ignorant eye. When writing
of Shakespeare's mind, and manners brightly shines in his well-torned, and true-filed lines, in each of which, he seems to shake a lance, to shake a spear, as brandished at the eyes of ignorance, sweet swan of Avon.
How can Shakespeare experts, and academe, be sure, that Jonson points to the river Avon of Stratford? They never explained to us why already in 1594, the poet Michael Drayton unmistakably praises the fame of the river Avon, in his sonnet 24, of Ideas Mirror, anticipating already his planned literary principal work Polyolbion. In Drayton's artistic topographical poem, and opus magnum, Polyolbion, 1612, second part 1622, divided into 30 songs, written in Alexandrine couplets, consisting in total of almost 15,000 lines. A verse, describing England. Drayton deals extensively, among other topographical things, with the various English rivers, named Avon, in England. In 1627, Drayton wrote in one of his elegies upon sundry occasions, a poetical essay, of poets and poesy, in which he reveals numerous personal insights on his own life, and on the early literary situation of English poetry. The subject of his essay was, to report on how those poets, including himself, still living, grew up. The author, by outing himself in a highly authentical manner, becomes recognizable as former Christopher Marlowe, who, from his childhood on, as a prodigy, was, still living, inclined to noble poesy, who in 1572 to 1575, accompanied Philip Sidney, as a young page, on his 3-year trip to the European mainland, with a stay at the English embassy in Paris in August 1572. At the event of the massacre in Paris, the English ambassador at that time was Francis Walsingham. And with a 10-month stay in Italy in 1574, disclosing that he was then a page, scarcely 10 years of age. Listen to a few sentences of the beginning of the essay.
Of these latter times, who have enriched our language with their rhymes, and in succession, how still up they grew, which is the subject, that I now pursue. From my cradle, you must know that, I, was still inclined to noble poesy. In my small self I greatly marvelled then, amongst all other, what strange kind of men these poets were, and pleased with the name, to my mild tutor merrily I came, for I was then a proper goodly page, much like a pygmy, scarce 10 years of age. Clasping my slender arms about his thigh, "O my dear master, cannot you," quoth I, "make me a poet? Do it, if you can, and you shall see, will quickly be a man."
That elegiac essay is full of allegorical allusions, not only to himself, Marlowe alias Drayton, but also to some of his false, or faked pseudonyms, or pen names, such as Shakespeare, Beaumont, Fletcher, Brownell. Read some exemplary texts.
Then, the two Beaumonts, and my Brown, arose, my dear companions, whom I freely choose my bosom friends. And in their several ways, rightly born poets, and in these last days, men of much note, and no less nobler parts, such as have freely told to me their hearts, as I have, mine to them. But if you shall say, in your knowledge, that these be not all, have written numbers, be informed, that I only myself to these few men do tie, whose works often printed, set on every post, to public censure subject have been most.
Marlowe's 818-line poem Hero and Leander had been registered late in 1593, after the alleged death of Marlowe, but published only early in 1598 by Edward Blunt, and dedicated to Marlowe's friend Sir Thomas Walsingham. The marigold woodcut emblem appeared on the title page of a second print of the poem Hero and Leander in the same year, suddenly structured into two sestiads, and astonishingly and significantly enlarged, finished by a second author, George Chapman, with the addition of 4 new sestiads, prefaced each with an argument, the 4 new sestiads dedicated to Lady Audrey, Sir Thomas Walsingham's wife.
Can anybody really believe that an independent poet, other than Marlowe, a certain Chapman, in 1598, had a motive, and the abilities, to amend the complex poem Hero and Leander at the same poetical level within months, and enlarge it by 2/3 of its previous volume? and will Shakespeare experts really making us believe that it is purely coincidental, in 1598, that Chapman's first stage play ever, The Blind Beggar of Alexandria in 1598, has no inner connections to Marlowe's allegoric fate, depicted in Marlowe Chapman's Hero and Leander also in 1598.
Chapman's play begins with a soliloquy of a Queen Egale, Elizabeth, sighing. Ah, Michael Ants, Marlowe, where art thou become? But since I saved thy guiltless life from death, and turned it only into banishment, forgive me, pity me. Be aware, that in the stage play, Michael Ants, Marlowe, had wooed the imperious Queen, Elizabeth, who rewarded his temerity by banishing him. He returned in the guise of the blind beggar and fortune-teller Ius. Anthers and Ius can be interpreted as the autobiographic blueprint of the author, Marlowe's first and second identity. Back to Hero and Leander. On the woodcut emblem, two marigold flowers, sharing one root, appeared on the title page of Marlowe Chapman's Hero and Leander in 1598. The metaphor, the deeper meaning of the allegoric marigold emblem seems obvious. It symbolizes the dichotomous fate of its author, Christopher Marlowe. The left flower facing the sun widely open, representing his first life, the right flower, being closed and bent downwards, facing darkness, clouds and rain, representing his life in obscurity, his second identity. Consider that also Shakespeare's Sonnet 25, which includes the marigold metaphor, is a blueprint of the author's, Marlowe's, fatal life situation. And, by no means, of William from Stratford.
Let those, who are in favor with their stars, of public honor and proud titles boast, while I, whom fortune of such triumph bars, unlooked for joy, in that I honor most. Great princes' favorites their fair leaves spread, but as the marigold at the sun's eye, and in themselves their pride lies buried, for at a frown, they in their glory die. The painful warrior, famous for worth, after 1,000 victories once foiled, is from the book of honor razed quite, and all the rest forgot, for which he toiled. Then happy I, that love and am beloved, where I may not remove, nor be removed.
Consider that Marlowe's marigold title emblem Hero and Leander also, and solely, decorates Drayton's, a paean triumphal, on the arrival of the new King James I in 1604. We can safely assume that this is not coincidental. Up to now, there is no plausible explanation of who was the highly educated Francis Mears, quoted in excess, due to his position as a singular key witness, when dating Shakespeare's plays. Countless questions about Mears have never been asked or answered. How in 1598 Mears could have had access, virtually to the complete and most recent literary scene of London and England, including 12 Shakespeare plays, which in 1598 had only began to be published under the name of Shakespeare. Mears describes the Earl of Oxford as the best for comedy, even though none of Oxford's plays have ever been listed or found. We must confine ourselves here to a few questions and conspicuous inconsistencies related to connections between Mears and Drayton. Why for Mears 3 editions in 1598, in 1634 and in 1636, title and subtitles were constantly and significantly altered? Who in real life embodied the treasury, the wealth and the academy of that stunning wit? Why an unidentified John Bodenham, and not Francis Mears, wrote the first part of Wit's Commonwealth, in 1597, also called Politeufeuia, a year earlier? Why, beyond the references to Shakespeare and poetry, the divine, moral, and philosophical similes, the golden sentences of the entire book of Mears are never quoted, and virtually unknown today? In Mears' chapter, Comparative Discourses on English Poets, Drayton gets not only significantly more mentions than any other on the Elizabethan literary scene, let alone Shakespeare, but Mears clearly reveals a strange, intimate knowledge and miraculous personal appreciation of Drayton, and of the contemporaneous community, you will not find in any other English poet mentioned. Listen to two examples of this chapter, A and B, but also to two others, of the almost unknown chapters of Mears' Divine and Golden Sentences, C and D. To be of an honest life and upright conversation, so Michael Drayton, among scholars, soldiers, poets, and all sorts of people is held for a man of virtuous disposition, honest conversation, and well-governed carriage, which is almost miraculous among good wits, in these declining and corrupt times, when there is nothing but roguery in villainous man, and when cheating and craftiness is counted the cleanest wit, and soundest wisdom.
You should answer the subsequent question yourself. Why, in 1598, is Drayton so much more extensively and personally highlighted by Francis Mears than Shakespeare?
Books of cosmography, with geographical tables, so Michael Drayton is now penning in English verse, a poem, called Polyolbion, geographical and hydrographical of all the forests, woods, mountains, fountains, rivers, lakes, floods, baths, and springs that be in England. How, on earth, can it be, that 14 years in advance, in 1598, Mears knew already about specific details of Drayton's Polyolbion project, which appeared in print only in 1612? Isn't Mears in his chapter of an ill name, reflecting on infamous pen names, a poet had to purchase a crooked surname because of his mischievous misdeeds such as, Tamburlaine, for his tyranny, the scourge of God? Listen.
Some have got unto them a surname, as of crooked legs, that is pen names or nom de plumes. So many, by their mischievous misdeeds, do purchase infamous and ill names, that is pseudonyms or fake names. Such, as Tamburlaine, Marlowe, for his tyranny, the scourge of God.
How can it be that Mears in his chapter of banishment or exile is anticipating Shakespeare's staged play of Coriolanus, which is assumed to be written between 1605 and 1608? Listen.
As Alcibiades, being banished by the Athenians, so Coriolanus was more beloved of the Volscians, among whom he lived in exile, than of the Romans, with whom he was a citizen.
There was only one truly great poetic genius in his time, Christopher Marlowe, born in the same year than Shakespeare, only 2 months apart in 1564, who in his 30th year in May 1593 was threatened by execution, following slanderous accusations against him by the English Crown and Church. A feigned death, staged in Deptford, with the help of Marlowe's employer, the senior advisor of Queen Elizabeth, William Cecil, Lord Burghley, saw him banished for his own safety, but at the price of a permanent loss of identity and name. William Cecil allowed Marlowe to escape into internal banishment and exile, writing henceforth behind a curtain of multiple pen names and pseudonyms. Prior to his feigned death, Marlowe was by far the most famous poet and dramatist and superstar of the London theatre. He wrote by no means only under the name of Shakespeare, but under many other pseudonyms as well, which he changed throughout his life, not the least for safety reasons. His multiple pseudonymities explain most of the paradoxes of the many Shakespeare authorship candidates, most of them with virtually no reliable live data. Others were simply inventions of names, or borrowed names of living or deceased persons like Shakespeare from Stratford. Marlowe was living, incognito after his alleged murder under changing pen names such as Ledoux, Toby Matthew, Thomas Shelton. And he was writing under an unimaginable number of changing pseudonyms such as Wither, Peacham, Davenant, May, Chapman, Sylvester, Sands, Drayton, Beaumont, Fletcher, Hayward, Shakespeare, Massinger and others. As absurd, ridiculous or unthinkable it may sound.
Consider. A scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. Max Planck.
In his homage, A Paean Triumphal, Michael Drayton, as a poet, was among the first who had rendered the services to King James I, on his accession to the British throne. His duty to his king, however, was so ill repaid, that he gave up all hopes of rising at court, and his obscure allegoric fable, The Owl, published a year after the coronation, is supposed to glance at persons and incidents connected with his disappointment. Drayton's allegorical satire, The Owl, in 1604 without any doubt, has an authentic, autobiographical background, related to the true author, making sense for Marlowe, but not for Drayton. The text can easily be interpreted as a blueprint on Marlowe's fatal life situation in 1604, but hardly to an unknown fate of Drayton. Listen to a 24-lines passage of The Owl.
The princely eagle leaving his abode, was from his court stolen secretly abroad, and from the cover, closely where he stood, to find how things were censured in the wood. Far in the thickets might a chattering hear, to which soon lending an officious ear, with a still flight his easy course doth make towards where the sound he perfectly does take. At every stroke with his imperial wings, the gentle air unto his feathers clings. and through his soft and callow down does flow, as loth so soon his presence to forego. And being at last arrived at the place where the poor owl in miserable case, for whom much sorrow everywhere was heard, sadly bemoaned of many a helpless bird. But when this princely jovial fowl they saw, as now delivered from their former awe, each little creature lifted up a wing, with, Ave Caesar, to their sovereign king. Who seeing the owl thus miserably forlorn, spoiled of his feathers, mangled, scratched, and torn, wiled him his name and quality to show, how and wherefore he suffered all this woe.
The term, Ave Caesar, points to documented evidence from the time when the play Edward III was performed, telling us that Christopher Marlowe was the play's author. Robert Greene's comments in his 1590 novel, Francesco's Fortunes, second part of Greene's Never Too Late, precisely match up the author with the play Edward III, solely containing the phrase Ave Caesar. Can Shakespeare experts really see it as coincidence that only a few years earlier, in 1600, Nicholas Britton in Pasquille's Passion compared his life situation not only in an identical manner with an owl, but also tells us that his poem cycle were begun by himself, but, similar to Marlowe Chapman's Hero and Leander, finished by somebody else, called Morphorius, that is by a non-visible sleeper? Listen.
No, no. Alas, it is in vain for me, to help the eyes, that joy not in the light. He, that is sworn, that he will never see, let him play buzzard, with his blinded sight. An owl will never have an eagle's flight. He, that is once conceited of his wit, must die of folly. There is no help for it. Can anybody really believe that Drayton's title emblem of his satire The Owl, and George Wither's emblem poem motif from his collections of emblems, Book 2/1, have nothing to do with each other? Have nothing in common?
An owl does not only keep alone, and not show herself in the daytime, but also if at any time she happen to be seen, all other birds do wonder at her. Wherein we see the state of a godly man well expressed. When he happened to dwell alone amongst a number and multitude of wicked men, he neither delighted in their company, and yet is a common guessing or wandering stock, when he happened to be among them. as his real opus 1 after his alleged death in 1593. The true Shakespeare composed the tragical verse legend on Roman mythological Lucrece, printed in 1594, illustrating, on a superficial level, the virtue of chastity, but on a deep level, the parable of Tarquin's, Marlowe's, serious misconduct towards Lucrece, Queen Elizabeth, which led to Marlowe's tragical fate. Lucrece must be understood, autobiographically, as a parable of the author's confrontation with the moral responsibility of his misconduct, his crash and loss of honor in 1593. Astonishingly, in Shakespeare's Year of Lucrece, 1594, Drayton composed a tragical verse legend on historical Matilda, also illustrating on a superficial level the virtue of chastity. In Drayton's Matilda, King John tries to seduce Matilda. She retreats to a nunnery. John sends a messenger to offer her the choice between dishonor or death. Matilda chooses death. In the revised versions, Drayton experimented and republished the poems, whereas in 1594 Matilda takes poison from the king's messenger and kills herself. In the 1605 and 1619 version, the king's messenger forcibly poisons Matilda. Again, on a deep level, Matilda represents the author's own poetic muse or inspiration. Marlowe seems to have realized if he wished the poem to serve as a metaphor of his destiny, then Matilda could not take her own life. He revised her death from suicide to murder. His personal muse was extinguished. Be aware that in 1594, in his introductory argument about Matilda, Drayton presents her, explicitly, as a second Lucrece. And in stanza 6 Drayton explains us, that the story of Lucrece had been revived, to live another age, and arrived in England and acted on the London stage.
Lucrece, of whom proud Rome hath boasted long, lately revived to live another age, and here arrived, to tell of Tarquin's wrong, her chaste denial, and the tyrant's rage, acting her passions on our stately stage. She is remembered, all forgetting me. Yet, I, as fair and chaste, as before was she.
Thus, Lucrece must have been staged in 1594. But, why was the author of the printed version of the stage play, The Rape of Lucrece, in 1608, neither Shakespeare nor Drayton? But instead, have you ever thought about the relationship between Heywood and Shakespeare? Could it really happen that within the beginning years of Shakespeare and Heywood's late poetical careers 1593, 1594 an aberrant obscene degree of plagiarism has taken place? Before reflecting a more plausible and honorable solution to our poets, just compare some sentences of Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis, with that of Heywood's Œnone and in Paris. In his England's Morning Garment, a certain Hen. Chettle criticizes contemporaries authors, for example Shakespeare, Chapman or Drayton, for failing having written an epitaph to Queen Elizabeth's demise. The title pages of the two editions in 1603 have neither the author's name nor the date of publication. One edition bears a tiny address to the reader at the end of the book, a farewell and signature Hen. Chettle, hardly to be discovered. The author alludes to chief contemporary poets, under fictitious, but identifiable names, such as Drayton, that is Corydon; Shakespeare, that is Melicitus; Chapman, that is Corin. One stanza clearly refers to the poet Michael Drayton, who under the title of sweet singer Corydon is entreated a. to not forget Elizabeth's demise in his book Polly Albion, and to make some amends, and b. that it was a fault to have written verses praising the new King James I, for example in a paean triumphal before he had mourned Queen Elizabeth's death. Is it conceivable that a minor poet, a certain Henry Chattel, in 1603, is rebuking the leading contemporary poets, Shakespeare, Chapman and Drayton? Why does Drayton, as Corydon, exceed the theme with Isabella in Marlowe's play Edward II? How does Chattel know that Drayton, as Corydon, writes on his book Polly Albion, which appeared only 10 years later? Why Shakespeare, as Melicitus, should sing Elizabeth her rape, death, done by that Tarquin, Marlowe? Why Chapman, as Corin, finished Musaeus' poem, Hero and Leander, after Marlowe's death? In Wit's Recreations, 1640, an anonymous author, in all likelihood, concealed Marlowe, published epigrams and epitaphs on contemporary poets. You may read an epitaph on Michael Drayton, which embellishes his monument in the Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, erected by Lady Anne, the Countess of Dorset. In 1630 she had married, as his second wife, Philip Herbert, 4th Earl of Pembroke, recipient of the First Folio and son of Mary Sidney. Drayton's body is said to be buried in his marble monument of the Abbey. Astonishingly, there does not exist an entry in the burial register.
Do pious marble let thy readers know what they, and what their children, owe to Drayton's sacred name, whose dust we recommend unto thy trust. Protect his memory, preserve his story, and a lasting monument of his glory, and when thy ruins shall disclaim to be the treasury of his name, which cannot fade, shall be an everlasting monument to thee. Shakespeare, we must be silent in thy praise, because our encomiums will but blast thy bays, which envy could not, that thou didst do well. Let thine own histories prove thy chronicle.
Concealed, under sanctions still in operation in 1640, the camouflaged, anonymous author of Wit's recreations, in all likelihood the true authentic Shakespeare alias Marlowe, still alive, speaking in the pluralis majestatis, discloses his life dummy. There seems to be no Stratfordian biographer who has ever cited that epigram. Such omission can only be attributed to avoiding the embarrassment Shakespeare presents.
Death did not kill unjustly this good man, but death, in death, by death, did show his power. His pious deeds and thoughts to heaven forerun, there, to prepare his soul, a blessed bower. Thou son of Mercury, whose fluent tongue made Lucan finish his Phasaelian song, thy fame is equal, better is thy fate, thou hast got Charles his love, he, Nero's hate. The history of Leander, personated upon the water, let into the amphitheatre, in which he praised the emperor as more merciful than Neptune. For this personated Leander was here, saved. The true one was drowned, in the Hellespont.
That this night see thy life, Leander, saves cease youth to wonder, they were Caesar's waves when bold Leander swam to his fair love, and against the swelling waves now wearied strove. Thus the approaching billows he bespake this life but going spare, returning take.
Who would live in others' breath? Fame deceives the dead man's trust. when our names do change, by death. Sans I was, and now am dust.
With the exception of Francis Mears' Pallades Tamia, there is no single work of so early a date, such as epigrams in the oldest cut and newest fashion, in 1599 by a certain John Weaver, which contain references by name to so many Elizabethan writers, such as Spenser, Johnson, Shakespeare, Marston, Daniel, Drayton, Warner, Middleton, Fletcher and many others. Where did we get all his insider knowledge? You may ask, why Marlowe is not included? Why Christopher Middleton and not Thomas Middleton? Why Nathaniel Fletcher and not John Fletcher?
Epigram 23. The peers of heaven kept a parliament, and for wits mirror Philip Sidney sent, to keep another, when they do intend. 20-1 for Drayton, they will send. Yet bade him, leave his learning, so it fled, and vowed to live with thee, since he was dead.
Weaver allegorically seems to reveal his personal situation. If the poet Philip Sidney would be alive, he would choose Michael Drayton for Haven's Parliament, but because of threats, Drayton fled. He fled pseudonymously and promised to live with him as ever since he, Marlowe, was officially dead. A second last observation. Weaver in his Opum Magnum 1631 on ancient funeral monuments in England, closed chapter 10 by writing about the hanging of John Penry late in the afternoon of May 29, 1593 with only a few beholders. Note, 24 hours before Marlowe's alleged killing. Was not one hanged of late, for libeling? Yes, questionless. And you deserve the same, for you before whole volumes forth did bring, and whom you pleased, did liberally defame. For shall we his, by right, a libel call, that touched but some? Not yours, that aimed at all? In 1600 a famous collection of 2,350 quotations of Elizabethan poetry, arranged by topics, entitled England's Parnassus, or the Choicest Flowers of Our Modern Poets was printed. The question whether Robert Allott, or Robert Armin, was the editor and compiler, has remained, to this day, a matter of speculation. Literally no biographical facts have come down to us about Robert Allott. In the arrangements of the quotations egregious blunders were committed. The works of Shakespeare, Drayton, Marlowe and others are frequently confounded. Identical passages are repeated, even at the interval of only a few passages, while the gross mistakes in the text are beyond all calculations. Hardly a page in the 510 pages is free from problems. From end to end of England's Parnassus, there is no hint at a single volume quoted, and that the representations there given of any poet's real words can be trusted. It constantly happens that famous passages belonging to one distinguished poet are attributed to another. For example, Shakespeare's speech by Gaunt in Richard II is transferred to Drayton. Please consider the strange coincidence, that in the same year as the appearance of England's Parnassus, in 1600, another author with the same initials R&A, Robert Armin, wrote two remarkable satirical reflections, Quips upon Questions and Fool upon Fool, touching the same, autobiographic basic theme of a second life, of death, of the wrong names etc. veiling behind the deceased famous contemporary London stage clown, Richard Dalton, who died in September 1588. Can Robert Armin really have been the author of the witty remarks or wisecracks? Quips upon question, or fool upon fool? Listen to exemplary quips upon two evocative ambiguous questions. First, who, in reality, is dead? Second, where is the fool? Who is dead? A man is dead, that long before this died 20 times, yet lived to die this day. It's strange, it should be so, yet so it is. But I will tell you how, and if I may. Yes, prithee do, for why, I long to know, how man can die, yet live and see to go. He by his trade dyes cloth, he is a dyer. A jest, no otherwise I understand. And I can witness you to be no liar. For he dyes all things that do come to hand. But he, that many times did die in jest, now once for all, vouchsafes to die in earnest.
Quip. To fools well met, to resolve each other's mind. Of that, in which the wisest eye is blind. I quip them thus. He, that before death dies, shall with the blind man see, yet want his eyes.
Well, to resolve this question, yet say I, that his name you hear, though he be gone. You say not, where is his body, that did die? But, where is he? Where is his name alone? His name is here, it is true, I credit it. His body is dead, few clowns will have his wit.
Quip. Though he be dead, despair not of your wisdom, what wit you have not yet, in time may come. But thus, we see two dogs strive for a bone. Bout him, that had wit, until themselves have none.
In his Biographical Chronicle of the English Drama, 1891, the Shakespeare expert Frederick Fleet came to the conviction that Shakespeare drew his sonnet material from Michael Drayton. He concluded a. that Shakespeare's sonnet followed Drayton's in time, b. that Drayton's influence was direct and forceful, c. that Shakespeare's dependence upon Drayton is general, and d. that it is one of word, thought, structure and content. For most, Fleet's thesis seemed utterly absurd, considered as the outlandish thesis of an outsider, that gradually fell into oblivion. Consider that we positively know from contemporary sources, payments, that Drayton was involved in the writing of more than 20 plays. It is very strange that none of these plays was ever published with Drayton's name attached to it, and only one play was published at all. Sir John Oldcastle, which bore on its title page, by William Shakespeare. There never has been a plausible explanation why Drayton in his essay on contemporary poets in his epistle to Reynolds A. does not mention any one of his coadjutors in these plays, such as Munday, Chattel, Dekker, Wilson, Webster, Hathaway, Smith, C. Middleton. B. but does mention Chapman, as a translator, Nash, Marlowe, Shakespeare, and Johnson. C. that literary experts claim, with good arguments, that Drayton must have been the author of the anonymous comedy The Merry Devil of Edmonton, a very obvious cunning spoof of Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. In 1628, in the third edition of his Latin handbook on rhetorics, Cheirogonia, Manuductio ad artem rhetoricam, the first edition appeared in 1621. An unknown highly educated author, Thomas Vickers, enlarged Latin chapter 6, on elocutio, that is on eloquence, by ranking Drayton among the best English poets, such as Chaucer, Spenser, Wither, Davies. Quite amazingly, he did not mention Shakespeare by name, but totally veiled him, that hardly any literary public at that time, without a deeper background knowledge, could have recognized him. He veiled the name of the poet Shakespeare behind the following Latin formulation.
Isti se numerando censio, celebromelum poetam, quioque satione and astronomen habet, meaning in English. To these, I believe, should be added that famous poet, who takes his name from shake, that is in Latin, quasitione, and spear, that is in Latin asta.
Definitely keep in mind, that this Latin passage, page 70, is not only immediately followed by highly praising reflections on Michael Drayton on the subsequent page 71, with some further amazing reflections on George Wither, and the author himself. But that these pages 71-72 of the second edition alone, stunningly are not written in Latin but in English. Drayton is portrayed as the towering poetical figure, a divine wit, deserving a golden shrine, an immortal pen. He is compared to the greatest poets of the past. To Homer, blind Grecian. To Virgil, Aeneas Clark. To Italian Petrarca, and to great traveler, circumnavigator Olivier van Noort. He should give up his ambiguous groundhendiards, that is, 2 for 1, and laurels, of what sort soever they be. And for England should, in Drayton's right, claim the Rex Poetarum, the royal poet's name. In 1644 a highly allegorical parody, or satire, The Great Assizes Holden in Parnassus by Apollo and his Assessors, of an anonymous author, long since attributed by experts to George Wither, was printed, in which 12 literary critics of the time, the so-called malefactors, are tried by Apollo and hauled before a jury of 12 contemporary poets, the so-called jurors. They accuse one another. The poetical satiric allegorical lawsuit can only be accessible to the reader, if he accepts the Marlowe, Shakespeare authorship thesis. Presupposing Marlowe's survival as well as his diversity of lifelong changing pseudonyms and writing activities of a singular true poetical genius. Consider that all 24 acting subjects represent one and the same person. A. 12 malefactors, writers of periodicals, pamphlets, newspapers within the 1640s. And B. 12 jurors, pseudonymous poets or poetical pen names, including Drayton, Shakespeare, and Wither. And how could it have happened that in 1645 the author expressed his wish that typography, an instrument of art, had never been used? That is, that his artificial pen name Shakespeare had not been adapted typographically from the real name William Shakespeare, Stratford, whom he described as a mimic, a pernicious head, who has in art no interest, an employed paper waster, a mercenary soul, a poetaster, a mercenary penman of the stage, a delinquent here, an error of the muses, an abortive wit, a foul fountain of abuse, a reptile, equivocally bred under some hedge. Underscore. These descriptions and characterizations point to the false Shakespeare, from Stratford. In 1621 an English author, Peter Heylin, published his popular bestseller Microcosmos, or A Little Description of the Great World, a mixture of history and geography, dedicated to Prince Charles, with 8 editions up to 1639. In his chapter on England, he briefly touches the matter of poesy, with their major representative poets. Just read and reflect the subsequent short passage. The chief in matter of poesy have been: first, Gower; second, Chaucer, of whom Sir Philip Sidney used to say, that he marvelled, how that man in those misty times could see so clearly, and how we in these clear times go so stumblingly after him. Third, Edmund Spenser; fourth, Drayton, and Daniel. If you consider that in 1621 William Shakespeare from Stratford was already 5 years dead, and the first folio not yet printed, what on earth may have happened, that the poet Michael Drayton, of a similar age to Shakespeare, is mentioned among the chief English poets? But Shakespeare is not mentioned at all? A certain William Browne, whoever he was, wrote as his chief literary work, a poem, Britannia's Pastorals, which appeared in 1613. A second book followed in 1616. The two books were reissued in an octavo volume in 1625. In Browne's second song of the second book of Britannia's Pastorals, in 1616, he seems to show that he was on terms of intimacy with poets of his day, such as George Wither, John Davies, Christopher Brooke, Michael Drayton. He celebrated in verse great and discerning admiration. Listen to the lines for Michael Drayton.
Our second Ovid, the most pleasing muse that heaven did ever in mortal's brain infuse. All loved Drayton, in soul-raping strains. A genuine note, of all the nymphish trains. Began to tune, on it all ears were hung. As sometime Dido's on Aeneas' tongue.
How could it happen that William Browne praised the poet Michael Drayton to the skies, calling him our second Ovid, at a time when Shakespeare was still alive? If at that time all admired the poet Drayton as the most pleasing muse that heaven did ever in mortal's brain infuse, how is that compatible with the missing mention of Shakespeare, in 1616, the year of death of Shakespeare from Stratford? Why, in the same breath, are we reminded that similar to Michael Drayton, once all ears were hung to Marlowe's play Dido, Queen of Carthage? This remarkable context between Drayton and Marlowe cannot be coincidental, and it points to the concealed true poet genius. Browne, in the same song, praises not only Michael Drayton and the other English poet names, in all likelihood pen names of the true poet. He explicitly also points to an anonymous or unnamed swain, poet, of great fame, her virtue is following him. Listen.
True fame is ever likened to our shade, he soonest missed her, that most has made, to overtake her. Whoso takes his wing, regardless of her, she will be following. Her true propriety she thus discovers, loves her contemners, and contemns her lovers. The applause of common people never yet pursued this swain, he knew it, the counterfeit of settled praise, and therefore at his songs, though all the shepherds and the graceful throngs of semi-gods compared him with the best, that ever touched a reed, or was addressed in shepherd's coat, he never would approve their attributes, given in sincerest love, except he truly knew them as his merit. Fame gives a second life to such a spirit.
In 1658 an author, Aston Coke, published divers sorts of poems, elegies, eglogues, satires, letters etc., which must have been written decades earlier. The first of his funeral elegies was about the death of Michael Drayton. There he wrote among others,
"Therefore, we must not mourn, unless it be, because none is left worthy, to follow thee. It is in vain to say, thy lines are such, as neither time nor envy's rage can touch, for they must live, and will, whiles there's an eye, to read, or wit, to judge of poetry." Coke about Drayton. To say, thy lines are such, as neither time nor envy's rage can touch. Johnson about Shakespeare. I confess, the writings to be such, as neither man nor muse can praise too much. You swans of Avon, change your fates, and all sing, and then, die at Drayton's funeral. Sure, shortly there will not a drop be seen, and the smooth pebbled bottom be turned green, when the nymphes, that inhabit in it, have, as they did Shakespeare, wept thee to thy grave. But I molest thy quiet sleep, whilst we, that live, would leave our lives, to die like thee.
Note that the author speaks of at least two swans of Avon, Drayton and Shakespeare. They should change their fates. Shortly nothing, not a drop, a fall, would be found, that is, those poets do not exist, in their alleged graves. The true poet, still alive, would leave his lives to die like those swans. In Aston Coke's chain of golden poems, in a chapter entitled Encomiastic Verses on Several Books, you find a homage of 3 pages, dedicated to the new book of Master William Dugdale, entitled Antiquities of Warwickshire Illustrated, printed 1656. The laudatory verses of Aston Coke, on this large volume book, with references to thousands of Warwickshire locations, stunningly refer to an obscure passage about the provincial town of Stratford-upon-Avon, about Shakespeare's muse and sweet-tongued Drayton. Read and listen.
You make the dead to live, they spoil the dead. Now Stratford-upon-Avon, we would choose thy gentle and ingenuous Shakespeare muse. Were he among the living yet, to raise to our antiquaries merit some just praise, and sweet-tongued Drayton, that hath given renown unto a poor, before, and obscure town.
You may notice that the author of the encomium, in the context of Stratford-upon-Avon, elucidates that he did not choose Shakespeare, the man, but instead his gentle and ingenious muse, to raise some just praise, belonging to sweet-tongued Drayton, who gave renown unto a poor, and, prior to him, obscure down, Stratford.
Poem 69. Shakespeare, your Wincot tale has much renowned. That fox to beggar so, by chance was found sleeping. That there needed not many a word, to make him to believe, he was a lord. But you affirm, and in it seem most eager. It will make a lord as drunk as any beggar. Bid Norton brew such ale, as Shakespeare fancies did put Kit Sly into such lordly trances. And let us meet there, for a fit of gladness, and drink ourselves merry in sober sadness.
The Warwickshire village Wincot, near Stratford, was celebrated for its ale. The author undoubtedly alludes not only to the false Shakespeare from Stratford, note the spelling, and to the prologues of The Taming of A. Shrew, anonymous in 1594, or The Taming of There, Shrew, Shakespeare, First Folio in 1623. But also to Christopher, Kit Marlowe, Sly. The prologue of The Taming of the Shrew, with no relation whatsoever to the play itself, clearly can, and must be recognized as the simile to Marlowe's fateful life situation.
Poem 99. Donne, Suckling, Randolph, Drayton, Massinger, Habington, Sands, May, my acquaintance were. Johnson, Chapman, and Holland I have seen, and with them too, should have acquainted been. What needs this catalogue? They are dead and gone. And to me, you are all of them, in one.
Aston Coken seems to confess in a roundabout way, that all of these authors were acquainted with him and all of them are one and the same. Could it be possible, that a certain Charles Cotton, translator of Montaigne's essays, born in 1630, could be acquainted with Drayton, who died in 1631? Who actually was Aston Coken?
Epitaph, 120. On Master Michael Drayton. Buried in Westminster, ad Marmatumulge. Do pious marble let thy readers know, what they, and what their children, owe to Drayton's sacred name, whose dust we recommend unto thy trust. Protect his memory, preserve his story, and a lasting monument of his glory, and when thy ruins shall disclaim, to be the treasury of his name. His name, which cannot fade, shall be an everlasting monument to thee.